So we're in personal injury. And we learned the first Mishnah of the 8th chapter, which really sets out the framework for the whole of the 8th chapter. So we learned that unlike the pasuk, which says, unlike the verse, which says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, we don't do an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. We do financial compensation in 5 dimensions. We do damage, pain, healing expenses, time, and embarrassment. We assess damages. And the first Mishnah in the 8th chapter just outline what all of these mean. And then the Mishnah then picks up in the second Mishnah of the 8th chapter, as if to differentiate this chapter and everything in it from what has gone before. Remember, until now we talked about the ox. We talked a little bit about the fire and a bit about the pit, but really we talked about the ox. Most of the material in the first few chapters of Bava Kama is about the ox. So we've learned about personal injury. And the Mishnah declares, Ze chomer ba'adam mi bashor. This is stricter for a man than it is for an ox. So personal injury is different. And in the Kaufman manuscript, it actually repeats this. Chomer shuv ba'adam mi bashor. Stricter again for a man than from an ox. Sheh adam mishalem et. Because a person pays for, and all the manuscripts say damage. Sha'adam mishalem et hanezek. A person pays for damage. And then most manuscripts go on to say, list the other four of the 5. Tsa'ar, ripui, shevet, uvoshet. Pain and healing and time and embarrassment. And these are missing, by the way, from Kaufman. I don't know why, but I think they should probably be in, and I put them into the source sheet in square brackets. Because that's the principle, that when we're dealing with personal injury, we assess damages along these 5 dimensions. And by the way, umushalem demei v'ladut, and we also pay for damage to the young. We have a verse, v'chinatsu anashim v'nakafu isha hara. This is all from these chapters in Exodus. It's from the Parsha of Mishpatim. When 2 people fight and they strike a woman who's pregnant and she miscarries, they have to pay compensation for the miscarriage. So when we're dealing with personal injury, when a person creates personal injury, he pays for a miscarriage. V'shur eino mishalemet and eila nezek ufatur midmei v'ladot. The ox damage is only assessed according to damage, not the other 4 dimensions. And it doesn't have to pay for miscarriage. The verses dealing with miscarriage deal specifically with 2 people fighting who bash into a woman who's pregnant. They don't deal with an ox who, I don't know, spears a woman or frightens a woman who's pregnant. So damage caused by a human is more severe than damage caused by an ox. But there are some exceptions. Someone who strikes his father and mother and doesn't inflict a wound. So you might think that these are captured by other principles. The punishment in both of these is karet, is cutting off, for striking your father and mother but not making a wound, or for breaking well, you've basically broken Yom Kippur if you're beating up your friend on Yom Kippur. So you're liable for karet, but karet is, so to speak, in the hands of heaven. So you're still liable for all 5. Chayav b'chulam. You're still liable for all 5 dimensions of personal damages. Hachovel be'eved ivri. If you wound a Hebrew slave, you're liable for all of them, for all five. Chutz min hashevet, apart from loss of time, loss of income. Bisman shehu shelo, if it's your slave. In other words, and the assumption is that you essentially own the time of the Hebrew slave. So if you injure your own Hebrew slave, you're kind of not liable for your own time that is lost. Hachovel be'eved ivri shel acherim. If he wounds someone who wounds another person's, well, this is a Hebrew. In Kaufman says Hebrew slave. Most texts say Canaanite slave. Chayav b'kulam. He's liable for all of them. And Rabbi Yudah here says, Rabbi Yudah Omer, Ein la'avodim boshet. Slaves don't receive compensation for embarrassment. Really interesting idea about the status of a slave. By the way, the Rambam tells us, Ein halacha ka Rabbi Yudah. The halacha is not like Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yudah says slaves don't receive compensation for embarrassment. Rabbi Yudah, the halakha doesn't go according to Rabbi Yudah. Rabbi Yudah is based on a verse in Devarim, in Deuteronomy, when two people fight. So there seems to be some personal injury going on. When two people fight, yachdav, together, and the verse continues, Ish ve'achiv, a man with his brother. Rabbi Yudah seems to be saying that these statutes only apply when someone is fighting his brother. And Rabbi Yudah would say, oh, okay, a Canaanite slave is not your brother. So he doesn't receive compensation for embarrassment. I mean, we will learn later on, by the way, the compensation goes to the master or the owner of the slave. So let's not think that the Mishnah is quite as enlightened as some other societies might have been. Doesn't admit the complete brotherhood of man. But anyway, the halakha doesn't go according to Rabbi Yudah. And then it then begins to articulate a number of other encounters. An encounter with a deaf mute or an idiot or a minor, shoter is translated here as idiot. Maybe I should just say someone who's mentally deficient, someone who's got limited capacity. The encounter is a bad encounter. Why is it a bad encounter? Someone who injures them is liable, so you can't injure them. But if they injure others, they're exempt. They don't have full legal capacity. Someone who doesn't have legal capacity cannot be brought to court for the damage that he or she causes. So you can't damage them, and the court can fine you on their behalf. But if they damage you, there's not much you can do about it. And the Mishnah goes on to say, an encounter with a slave or a wife is also a bad encounter. You don't want to get involved here. And same reasoning. Someone who injures them is liable. But if they injure others, they're exempt. With a small exception, they might pay after some other time. They might have some long-tailed liability. We would call that in the financial sector a long-tailed liability, a long-dated liability. Nidgar shah isha. So if the woman is divorced, she now has agency. Ve nishtachrer ha'eved, or the slave is freed, and so he now has agency. Chayavin l'shalem. At that point, they have to pay. At that, they acquire agency, and at that point, they have to pay. Hamakeh just to finish off the story of someone who strikes his father and mother. So we learnt just now that if someone who strikes his father or mother and makes a wound, we just learned that if he doesn't make a wound, he's liable to pay. If he doesn't make a wound, he's liable for damages. If he does make a wound, or let's carry on, or he wounds his fellow on Shabbat. So he attacks someone not on Yom Kippur, but on Shabbat. On Yom Kippur, we've said the punishment is karet. It's cutting off. It's a heavenly punishment. But the punishment for these offenses are death, and they're kind of earthly punishments. And so the Mishnah rules, patur mikulam. He's not liable for any of these 5 dimensions of damages. Why not? Because he's going to be judged for his life. If you're judged for your life, you're not liable for civil damages. The capital framework takes precedence over the civil framework. If you're on trial for your life, small mercy, you don't have to pay criminal damages. You don't have to pay civil damages. And someone who wounds his Canaanite slave is not liable for any of these. And the reasoning seems to be that, gosh, the damages would accrue to him anyway. The damages would accrue to him anyway, so he's not liable for damages.